All right, guys. So I'm sure you've seen this going around. Basically, there's a statistic, and it comes from this website. It comes from UN Women, United Kingdom. I think it's an organization. I don't think it's directly associated with the UN. I'm not entirely sure. UN Women is the only global organization working to make gender equality a reality. Maybe it is. I don't know. From grassroots programs with the most valuable or vulnerable women and girls to changing attitudes and helping governments design gender equal policy. Right. I think this is an overall really good thing. It's a really good thing to be an advocate for women. Women do face specific and unique issues that men don't, and also vice versa. Yeah, so I'm like a full support of this. However, there's a statistic going around that 97% of women in the UK ages 18 to 24 receive some form of harassment, sexual harassment. And I looked through the report, and here's the thing. Here's my problem. Here's like the logical chain of events that's going to happen, right? When people hear this, they go, okay. And this is the report right here. They'll go, okay, 97 is really high. So I'm going to look into that because that sounds unrealistic. And then what happens when you look into it and you find out that there are a lot of questionable things, all of a sudden, most people, specifically the men who need to be hearing this, are going to tune out. I guarantee you most of the men in my chat are going to tune out to women's issues because of this, right? They're going to tune out because of this report, because they're going to be like, well, this is unrealistic. And then when you look through it, you find different spots where it is very unrealistic, right? Again, advocating for women's rights. Women have a unique set of issues. We need to be focusing on women. There is definitely a power dynamic, even in our everyday life, just a physical power dynamic, a financial power dynamic. There's a lot going on here, right? And so I think that it's necessary to look at these issues. Okay, so what I'm more interested in is, my understanding is that like it's like 1,000 or 1,400 people. I have no reason to think that like, I know a lot of people are like, oh, it's only 1,000 people. That's generally how we do statistics. I'm not going to really discredit that. That's not something that I'm particularly worried about. So this is the definition here. The challenge of defining sexual harassment. Let me actually do it like this. I think that'll be easier. So, women's attitudes towards reporting incidents of sexual harassment are intrinsically linked to their definition of sexual harassment, right? Which is true, right? Of course, you're not going to report something if you don't interpret it as such, and we do have a normalization of sexual harassment to an extent in society that would cause people to be like, it's not such a big deal, right? Examples of this would be getting flirted on, would having like a boss flirt with you at work and you just kind of dismissing it as not a big deal. But there is a power dynamic there, and it's very uncomfortable when you're somebody in a position of power, especially like from your employment, does make advances towards you, because you might feel like you can't say no or else they'll fire you, which I know is illegal, but you can technically fire anybody for any reason. So it's really difficult to make the argument that it was because you wouldn't that it was actually because you wouldn't go along with their sexual advances, right? UN Women define sexual harassment as a continuum of violent practices against women and girls. It could take the form. I think it would have to be sexual violent practices, but okay, it can take the form of various acts, including we'll say the RA word, other aggressive rape, other aggressive touching, forced viewing of pornography, taking and circulating sexual photographs, as well as verbal sexual conduct. In effect, sexual harassment is unwelcome sexual conduct. The new UN, blah blah blah, follow definition. Yeah, sexual harassment, rape. Okay, yeah. So I 100% agree. These are the 100% agree. What I'm more interested in is as we move down, it kind of gets into like the meat and potatoes here of these different things, and that's really here, right? So that's these statistics. Right. So these are the statistics. These are basically, this is how this works. There's a questionnaire that's sent out to people. I believe they did it online, and they ask you questions, and it's up to the individual to interpret those questions and then answer those questions. Right. Right. So these are the different things. Now, for context, it says public space, right? It says women who have experienced sexual harassment in a public space. Those public spaces, they're considering online spaces public spaces as well, which isn't something you would generally think of, but they are including that, right? And I'll show you where they say that as we go through it. So we're going to go through these different things. The first of which on this list, So it says the survey highlighted the most common forms of sexual harassment of those listed are being catcalled or wolf whistled. Now, this is just generally down there. It breaks the statistics up into age group. We're going to just focus on the general ones, and these are the questions asked. So the first question we would ask is like, were you catcalled or wolf whistled, right? Which is just, I guess, catcalling. I don't really know what the difference is, but I think that we can make a reasonable assumption. That's just like the same thing, basically, right? So that's 51%, right? There's really no justification here. I would give them pretty much all of that. What I will say is that there might be an argument to be made that some women, and this isn't something I'm holding firm to, but some women interpret just normal dating practices in public as some kind of a inappropriate catcall or whistle. Maybe I'm wrong with that. I think it's a reasonable thing to say that sometimes things like that do happen. Honestly, if an ugly guy hits on you, you're much more likely to say that it's inappropriate than if an attractive guy hits on you. I'm just bringing up for context. I would still give them this statistic. I don't really think that this is particularly problematic. This one, though, I have a big issue with, and that's being stared at is 44% of this data, right? So I have a huge issue with this because this is basically only has to happen once in your entire lifetime for you to have experienced some kind of sexual harassment. And being stared at is such a loose interpretation. Me personally, I hyperfixate on things in public, right? I have ADHD. I've unintentionally stared at people, not just women in society. So let's say a normal person goes out into a public space, and because you can't really do an online space in this context, because of course, like, you can stare at somebody you can, but nobody can see you, right? So let's say you go to the mall. You go like an hour a week, right? For 10 years, you went to the mall for an hour, for 520 times, for an hour at a time. The likeliness of somebody that has some form of like neuroatypical behavior is pretty likely. So how many of these people are either somebody who might be like me, who hyperfixates, or somebody who's socially awkward, because now we have a generation that's dependent on phones? I don't think that staring is a reasonable form of sexual harassment. I'm sure there's instances where it could be, but I feel like those are more outliers than anything else. I feel like most people in public stare. A lot of people are awkward, and then there's also people with mental conditions. And like, I really just don't think that this is like a reasonable question to ask or to indicate that it's sexual harassment. Next one is unwelcome touching, body rubbing, or groping. 100%. Like, there's no contesting this whatsoever. Yeah. Let's see. In-person comments or jokes. So this one could definitely be considered sexual harassment. I would honestly give this to them. There's very difficult to contest. Like, if you're somebody making some kind of an inappropriate joke towards a woman, like, you shouldn't be doing that. Generally, in like workplace settings, that's not something that you do with women. It's just kind of, you don't. Like, if you're with just men, like, men have different boundaries when it comes to like these types of jokes. They generally don't find much of an issue with it. Women do. So like, there's no defending this one either. Unwelcome sexual advances or requests for sexual favors. Again, this one's very difficult to like, you can't like, oh no, this is also some form of sexual harassment. What I will say is that since we're including online spaces, I wonder how much of this is somebody in the comments being like, oh, I want to suck your tits, you know what I mean? Which is still completely inappropriate. Being physically followed, that one I would probably give to them, though. I'd probably give that one to them, though it seems very loose. Like, is physical following somebody walking after you, be like, hey, I want to hit on you, or I want to ask you out? I don't know. This seems to be very vague, but I'm still going to give it to them. Indecent exposure, there's no justifying that. Online comments or jokes. That one's kind of weird to me, right? Because here's the thing. Let's say that you're on Instagram and you post a picture of yourself in a bikini and somebody makes an online comment or joke about you. We haven't had a reasonable conversation as a society as to whether that is or isn't sexual harassment, right? So let's say you're a woman in public and you're wearing a very revealing outfit. You're going into public as a necessity. So people catcalling you is completely inappropriate. You wearing that is for whatever you're wearing it for, right? So if it's for your boyfriend to see, like, your boyfriend is the only one that's allowed to make comments. You have the outfit on and you're in society. Maybe you want people to think you're attractive, but you're not inviting comments onto your body. Or maybe you're going to a club, right? However, when it comes to an online space, if you take a picture of yourself in a bikini, you're specifically showing people yourself in a bikini, right? So we do have to have a conversation about what is or isn't appropriate. But making an online comment like, "Oh, you're beautiful," I wouldn't say constitutes sexual harassment. Saying something like, "Oh, I want my peepee inside of you," that's definitely some form of sexual harassment. But to make this like sweeping generalization of online comments or jokes, I think is far too loose to be a reasonable thing to factor in fully, right? Sharing of suggestive or indecent content online or in person. Again, this is kind of the same thing as like the jokes we were talking about before. In-person comments or jokes, it's very similar. It's like really, I guess, indefensible. Being forced to participate into sexual behavior is literal rape. That is the actual definition of rape. And had images taken and or shared without consent. Again, that's like a violation for sure. And there's none of these, right? So as we go through that, my biggest problem is a lot of these are just so vague. And what that tells me is that they were less interested in actually figuring out like sexual harassment, and they're more interested in pushing a narrative of massive widespread sexual harassment, which is really unfortunate because there is issues of like widespread sexual harassment, and furthermore there's issues of normalizing like what I would consider predatory behavior in society. The problem is that we can't have an honest conversation when we have dishonest statistics that support that. I find it to be very problematic. These are the breakdowns of different groups, which is very interesting. And I want to like kind of go into it. So there's something that you notice when you look at this, and it's that the older the person gets, the less they feel that they've been harassed at some point in their lifetime, right? Now, that says a couple of things to me. The first thing it says is that older people tend to not interpret actual forms of sexual harassment as sexual harassment. And it's more normalized to them, right? Like older women, and my mom's included, will like put up with it because it's like, it's not a big deal. They understand, like, or that they understand, I guess that's just how men are, which isn't like reasonable, right? But like that's how it was for their time, right? So they have a lower interpretation of sexual harassment. However, it also indicates to me that there could be a reasonable argument to be made that women nowadays are looking to be offended over some things that may not necessarily be sexual harassment, which we obviously just kind of encountered with some of these really shitty questions. And like I said, my biggest issue is that the people who need to understand that there are unique issues with women and that women need to be advocated for are mostly men, young men. And when you put a statistic like this out, that's very dishonest and very easy to just completely like, deconstruct because of like the way that these questions are worded, it makes people tune out to real issues. So I would argue that this is a net loss for women, honestly. Right? This is like the type of content. Like there's two different audiences for your content. There's the audience of people who already agree with you, and then there's the audience of people who disagree with you. The people who agree with you are going to agree with you regardless, right? People that are going to be like, well, just because it's a fake statistic doesn't mean that it doesn't show a problem. Well, yeah, no shit. But people who are going to disagree with you, those are the people that you need to, those are the people you're trying to educate. And this misses the mark 100%. Now, again, I want to tell you guys, telling you from me, that like there are issues with women, and just because this is a really shitty statistic here and a really bad example, or this was a terrible collection of data, doesn't invalidate that.